Hey everyone, welcome back to Upside Down Data. Today I want to talk about Hedera decentralized identity and why I think that might be underappreciated in the crypto space. So to kick us off, let's talk a little bit about what is this idea of decentralized identity. In brief, this is really the idea that maybe using blockchains, we can actually come up with more secure identification systems than the current systems. Currently, identification is quite a messy thing to prove that you are who you are. This can be things like formal government identification, or in the US, for example, things like your social security number, so on and so forth. But there are inherent privacy problems, security problems with those systems. That with a social security number, for example, you're required to give that out in certain situations, and you really just have to hope that it doesn't fall into the hands of bad actors. You just have to trust a lot of third parties to not mismanage that data or to get hacked or anything like that. And then, of course, if that does happen, it can be quite devastating, identity theft, a lot of nasty consequences. So the idea with something like decentralized identity is the ability to take these legacy systems that have a lot of these security problems and make them a lot more trustless, being on DLTs. And the idea here would be, for example, let's take the social security number example as an example here, that instead of having one number that you'd be forced to give out to potential employers and people like that, instead what way it would work is that you'd have a private key that only you know about, but then you could use that private key to do a cryptographic signature to prove that you have that, but then it's unknown to anyone there. You can verify who you are without showing that underlying secret. And so in this kind of a scenario, no one would need that secret information. You can just prove that you are who you are because you have that private key. And so this idea of decentralized identity takes that general idea and also, of course, takes it further. It's this idea of being able to give people identity or credentials or what have you, and then be able to know that someone who's using that credential is who they say they are because they're the only ones that have that private key. If I know that I give, let's say, Bob some credential, then I know that anyone who then comes back with that credential must be Bob because Bob's the only one who knows his private key. And that's obviously, there's some assumptions there that Bob's not an idiot and didn't give away his private key. So obviously there's some things like about that, which might have to have some further security things built out. But generally speaking, that should probably be a more secure system than if I, for example, give someone a password that anyone else could get that password and use it. And I have no idea if Bob's the one using the password or if it's someone else. And so Hedera has their own decentralized identity SDK that they have, which enables a bunch of different functions, including things like being able to revoke credentials, which would probably be important. If somehow someone got hold of a credential they're not supposed to have, they got hold of a private key they're not supposed to have, it's not just permanent, they can access anything, that you're able to revoke it, things like that. And the reason why I think this is underappreciated is I think this idea actually is incredibly powerful, especially in the current environment that we find ourselves in, especially in terms of cyber security. So I want to talk about this in a little bit more depth here. So one of the big things that we're faced both in crypto and beyond are issues of things like, for example, SIM swaps, which is a social engineering attack where basically people figure out what your phone number is. They then contact your phone carrier and then they convince the phone carrier that they are you. And then they get the phone carrier to swap your number onto a SIM that the attacker is holding. And then they use that to get past two-factor authentication, and they can use that to drain your Coinbase account or other things. And so, for example, recently Friend.tech has been having issues of people SIM swapping users and then draining them of funds, of their keys that they hold on Friend.tech, so on and so forth. And we also just know this happens more broadly with phishing, that even if it's just an email that's sent to be looked like an official source, or maybe a tweet or something like that, that people can oftentimes go sign some malicious transaction, lose a lot of money. And so, as I mentioned, these are all different forms of social engineering attacks, basically convincing you that you are, or the attacker convinces you that you are someone who you're not, that you're a legitimate source, and that you're interacting with this legitimate source, and then they take advantage and they rob you. Now, this goes back to this idea of decentralized identity, I think, pretty importantly here. Imagine a world where any email you get has to have been signed by the sender. So let's say that a given sender has a known decentralized identity, that basically the public key, and then they hold the private key that no one else has. And so let's say, for example, everyone has this. Let's imagine all big organizations have it. Let's say, imagine that Coinbase has their own decentralized identity. If they ever send you an email, every email is signed with their cryptographic signature to prove that it came from them and that it didn't come from someone else. That would make these phishing attacks a heck of a lot harder. If you get an email and then it can't be validated that this came from Coinbase based on that cryptographic signature, which can be validated on a DLT like Hedera, or in theory other ones, but Hedera being one that's building out infrastructure in the decentralized identity space. Then if you see that and you see it can't be validated, why are you going to take it as real? You wouldn't. You would say, okay, this must be fake. It can't be verified that this came from Coinbase. You can imagine this across a whole variety of things, text messaging, even tweets, things like that, where you could verify that this person is really who they say they are because of this other known decentralized identity out there. Now, obviously, this would require other infrastructure to be built out so that those known decentralized identities could be there and that you could trust that, this cryptographic or this address, for example, belongs to Coinbase. So anyone who is able to sign a cryptographic signature to prove that they hold a private key must be Coinbase. There'd have to be infrastructure built out around that. But you can imagine that that would be a much better system where we have right now, where really, if you get an email from email address that looks similar to Coinbase, it's hard to really know. You kind of just have to, most of the time, just assume that any email you get is malicious and just kind of go with that. And frankly, there's a lot of utility then in a lot of our communications networks that being lost because oftentimes we can't even trust what we're getting. And so it's not even useful to use email for a lot of things because people won't be able to trust that you are who you say you are, and they shouldn't trust who you say you are. And so a lot of utility is lost. But imagine a world where that wasn't as much of an issue. And something that has also been cropping up a lot more recently is the issue of AI and its ability to be used to try to manipulate people, to trick them into thinking that, for example, popular figures, like in this example here, Mr. Beast, someone ran an ad on TikTok, which was a deepfake of him trying to scam people. Or, for example, here in Slovakia, there's issues where they're using AI to engage in disinformation campaigns around elections, using deepfakes to try to manipulate that election. And so this is going to become an increasing problem, in my opinion. I think we're going to see, not only is social engineering a chronic problem that's been around for a while, but it could be the case that AI and how good it's been getting at spoofing things like people's voices, spoofing people's images, and spoofing video, that in 5 years, in 10 years, it could be a much bigger problem where we can't even really trust anything that we're seeing online because we don't know if it was just made up by AI or if it's actually real. And so it's probably not a surprise that budgets for cybersecurity have been going through the roof as we get into this type of environment. So in the year 2023, it's expected that global cybersecurity spending is going to top almost $220 billion. But then there's also speculation that this is going to grow in orders of magnitude, reaching into the trillions before too long. And as I was mentioning with AI, this might just become a bigger and a bigger problem. That's going to be harder and harder for companies to fight off these social engineering attacks because of how good other people are at spoofing. You just imagine that all you'd have to do is just get a small voice sample of an employee or an executive at a company, and then you could go in and you could just pretend to be them using AI, and imagine the havoc you could wreak and how airtight people's security would have to be to prevent that. But again, with this idea of decentralized identity, if every single communication that ever was sent had this verification a part of it, as powered by something like a DLT, like Hedera Hashgraph, this is the HBAR chart, or over here on the decentralized page, just imagine how much easier life would become if you didn't constantly have to be worrying about, am I actually speaking to who I think I am, if they could just simply prove it by signing a cryptographic signature that proves that they hold the private key and therefore they must be who they say they are, because no one else has that private key. No one else could do that. Same thing with AI created images or videos. You can imagine that each of these would have to have their own cryptographic signature that then points to where they originated from. Did they actually originate from Mr. Beast, or is it somewhere else? And you'd be able to verify that. And so you could imagine that this infrastructure could get built in a lot of different ways, where basically any content you see anywhere, you're able to go in and validate, is it really coming from where it's supposed to be coming from? And so that's one of the things I haven't seen spoken about as much, at least openly. Obviously, this is an idea people have talked about more generally with decentralized identity, although I feel like people oftentimes stopped when they talk about this in terms of just basically making it so that you can just prove who you are yourself, so you don't have to rely on things like passports or whatever the case may be to prove who you are, that you just have that. But I think that's only a small part of what this could become. And so I think what we're really talking about here is a massive use case for crypto. And this is one of the things that I think is really critical as we're going into the next bull market, or certainly as we might be trying to work our way out of this next bear market, is what are those major use cases for crypto going to actually be? We've seen a lot of infrastructure built, a lot of alternative L1s out there, things like Hedera Hashgraph, which is really an infrastructure. It's a DLT that's supposed to be, things are supposed to be built on top of and to be used. But what are those big uses going to be? And I think this is one that's a bit slept on right now more recently, is that I think we're going to go into a world, I don't think it's totally unreasonable to say that we're going towards a world where it's going to be harder and harder and harder to trust anything in the digital space. And unless you're speaking to someone face to face, it's going to become harder and harder to know where the information is actually coming from. Is it actually real? Is it actually legit? And we're going to have to deal with that. I don't think we can just ignore that and think everything's going to be fine. I think we're going to have to come up with real solutions. And this is one of the things where I think crypto is very well suited to it, because crypto offers a solution, a way of coming to consensus that is trustless, that we don't have to worry about trusting some central figure to be right or some central organization to get things right. We just know it is because of the nature of decentralized consensus, this thing that is secured by monetary incentive and is extremely difficult to coerce. Basically, you'd have to do a 51% attack or take control of over a third of the validators of it, which is basically very difficult, especially if the value were to continue to rise of these protocols, to become almost impossible. So we're going to have to see how this all pans out. But it is, I think, a kind of a feather in Hedera's cap that they are working on this. And I'm not saying this is going to happen overnight. I think this is something that is years at the minimum for this kind of thing to take hold. But I do think we're going to see an increased need for this kind of a thing. And as crypto matures and as more use cases built on top of it, it would not surprise me if this is one of the ones that really starts to get built out. And the nice thing about this application also is it's less likely to run into some of the regulatory problems as some of the other ones. You know, we're not building derivatives here. There's no trading. This isn't a decentralized a DEX or anything like that. This is just simply using this DLT for what is ultimately a public good. So obviously, none of this is financial advice. You should be making your own opinions about this and what you think makes sense, and if you think that this is something that HBAR or Hedera is ever going to really capitalize on. But it is just something I wanted to mention. And again, this goes beyond just Hedera. This is something that could apply to basically any DLT out there. I wanted to talk about in the context of Hedera just because they have worked on it, but they're certainly not the only ones who are doing it. But it wouldn't surprise me if this becomes a bigger and a bigger thing, and then obviously anyone who's bullish on Hedera would like to see them be able to pick up a piece of that. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this, if you think that this is one of the big killer use cases of crypto. But it's one of the ones that, the more I think about it, makes a lot of sense. So I figured I'd go ahead and talk about it here. All right, if you like the content or subscribe to the channel, give the video a like and follow us on Twitter. Also check out our website, PolarityDigital.io, for live data from our models and more.